So lately there's been a Facebook post going around that indicated that the book of Revelation is unfolding before us. Are the events that are currently happening the specific fulfillment of the prophecies of the book of Revelation?
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Today, we're going to tell you everything you need to know about the book of Revelation. You guys ready? Okay, so we're not going to tell you everything that you need to know about the book of Revelation, but there are some who are looking at the things that are going on in the world right now, and they are tracing this back to the book of Revelation, and they are under the impression that what's going on right now is an unfolding of the things that were told by the Apostle John that we have recorded for us in the book of Revelation. So, is that true? Are these world events and the coronavirus and all these other things that are happening, is this Revelation unfolding right before our eyes?
One thing I think that's helpful to consider is that people have said for the last 150 years probably that every major crisis and world event, especially that has adversely affected them, has been a fulfillment of the book of Revelation, and that somehow these are the indications of the end times. So if you look at the period of the Cold War, if you go back even before that to the world wars, people were saying, this is it. This is the indication of the end time. And certainly in my lifetime, I was born in the late 80s, and so over and over and over again over the last 30 years have there been predictions that have obviously come to nothing as far as this being the sign that we're right here on the cusp of it. And I think something that's helpful is just to have some principles in mind when we're reading the book of Revelation, and to say that there's certainly something we can gain from the book of Revelation, but the idea that 2,000 years ago Christians in Asia Minor would have been helped by God giving them information about coronavirus in the United States in 2020 just seems a little bit narrow-minded, a little bit short-sighted as well.
In one sense, I mean, I think it's natural for us to try to, look at a book that we highly respect and say, okay, this is talking about me and this is talking about my situation. But the danger of misapplying this type of information is what you said, Larson, is we end up with people looking at the Bible and saying, well, it's just crying wolf all the time, and we need to be careful of that. So we want to try to make the right application. We want to try to understand exactly what's going on. And I think what we'd like to do in this podcast is probably just look at the introduction of the book, chapter 1, and try to let it tell us how we should read and understand this book.
Yeah, that's where I think, Larson, where your reference was coming from, talking about trying to apply current events to the churches in Asia Minor. Maybe what some people don't realize about the book of Revelation is that it was written to a group of churches in Asia, and they're all specified by name, and there are specific messages for each of those churches at the beginning of the book in chapters 2 and 3. And so part of it seems to me a fair way to interpret Revelation would be to begin with who was the audience and how was this message going to affect them.
Yeah, so if we think about principles for reading Revelation responsibly, I think the first one is to say is that it was written for us, but it wasn't written directly to us. And I think we should think about it in the same way that we would think about any other epistle that was written. So we have an epistle to the Romans and a couple of epistles to the Corinthians. And when we look at those books, we say, okay, what was the situation then? What did Paul say to them? How would they have understood that? And then, how does that apply to us? What are the instructions that are in that are relevant for us? It's all relevant. I don't mean to say that any of it is irrelevant. What I mean to say is there's a specific way of applying it, and we have those reasoning capabilities when we come to other books. But there's some differences in Revelation, and I understand that. But we ought to be thinking when we read the book of Revelation, we shouldn't first of all jump right into chapter 16 and say, okay, well, what verse here can I use to talk about our current situation? But we should also say, okay, how would the church at Thyatira have read this paragraph? How would the church at Ephesus understood this chapter? Because when we do that, then we're understanding what it was intended to say in the first place, and then we're in a better position to understand it for us.
Yeah, so we're concerning the idea of relevance. Find out, what the most likely specific explanation would have been for the readers. Mm-hmm. And then you can take those specific instances, and they can generally be applied to people in every generation. I think we can read Jeremiah, who's talking about the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. We can see specific applications to the fall of Jerusalem and God's ruling in the nations, and then we can make some general points about ourselves based on what Jeremiah has revealed about the character of God so many years ago.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are different about Revelation, but I don't think they alter maybe in some ways the way we're reading, but they do add some layers. So the word revelation, so chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ. That word revelation, some Bibles even refer to it as the apocalypse to John. And the idea of the apocalypse, when I think of the apocalypse, I think of the end of the world and Armageddon and this huge battle of good and evil. But really the idea of apocalypse means something like unveiling or uncovering. And it helps me to think about it like pulling back the curtain. So what Revelation is trying to communicate, what Jesus is trying to communicate in this revelation, is that even though we see forces at work in our physical world, really there's a deeper reality behind those things. So we see persecution, and we see false religion, and we see worldliness. And what the book of Revelation wants us to understand is really behind that is a terrible foe of humanity, and that is the dragon, the serpent from of old. And he's behind all of these evil things that are happening to God's people. And yet ultimately the message of Revelation is that God is fighting too, and he is going to destroy the devil, and he's going to imprison him forever. And we don't have to worry about whether or not the outcome is going to be accomplished. Now, why is that helpful? Well, just like Tad was saying, we don't have to look for specific relevance in each one of the specific ideas. We can look behind it and say, that's true all the time. It is always true that there's a great spiritual battle going on. And it's always true that the devil is the enemy of humanity. And it's always true that God's going to be victorious. So the book of Revelation says these things that we encounter from day to day are part of a much grander battle. And the way we fight is we stay faithful to the Lord, we keep enduring, we don't let go of him, we do right, and those are lessons that we can apply at every step along the way, even though we may not know the exact specifics of a specific passage.
Yeah, I think those are good applications for modern readers of the book of Revelation. Not that we're going to face the exact same things, but there are going to be difficulties. And anytime there's a difficulty in our life as a Christian, then we're prone to doubt, or maybe sometimes we want to compromise because that would make our life a little bit easier. And maybe sometimes quitting altogether seems like the right solution. And that's the audience when John was having this revealed to him. Christians were apostatizing because the turmoil was so hard, that the affliction for being a Christian, they were being forced to make such terrible decisions, and so many of them were apostatizing. So what's the message? Hold on, God is going to be victorious. In the moment, it doesn't look like God is winning. As a matter of fact, it looks like Satan is winning. But the ultimate message is that God is victorious. So I think that's a good point. If we're looking for how do we apply Revelation today, or what we take from it, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I mean, as these Christians were facing Satan, Revelation chapter 12 tells us that the reason these Christians are suffering is because Satan knows his time is short, that he's already been defeated in a decisive way. He does not have the position that he had to be able to accuse the brethren any longer. And that would really, so if you're the church at Sardis and you're suffering tremendous persecution, and you say, well, is Jesus really victorious? Has this turned out the way that God said it would? And the lesson of Revelation is not only is God going to be victorious, but the suffering you're facing now is an indication that he has already accomplished something very decisive in the history of salvation.
Yeah, so we were talking about, whether or not this book, we should apply this as if John is writing this directly to us. And going back to chapter 1, there are several things that are mentioned in chapter 1 that I think give us some clarity about how we should approach this, some things we should keep in mind. So you mentioned verse 1, the revelation or the unveiling of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. I think that's a time marker there. What is being revealed, what God is revealing to these individuals, and when we get down to verse 3, we'll see, or verse 4 rather, we'll see who he was directly revealing this to. But it has a time marker there. These are things which must shortly take place, and this was written sometime near the end of the first century. And so when we're thinking about things which must shortly take place, it's a difficult stretch to say, well, we're going to look 2,000 years ahead in a different continent and say that must be what was under consideration there. So naturally, as we would begin this book reading through there, we would not look for the fulfillment of these things to be something that is going to be thousands of years off, based upon what is revealed here in verse 1.
Yeah, and I think in verse 19 goes along with the point that you're saying, as John was told to write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. There is probably some future element to Revelation, particularly at the end of the book, but there is a lot of past and present as well. Things which you have seen, past tense, the things which are. Some of the things that John, just based on chapter 1, what he says here, some of the things that John writes about are things currently the way they were in the first century. So, yeah, that is, to me, a big deal in looking at Revelation, and I'm going to interpret it fairly. I've got some limitations now to work within so far as the specifics are concerned. Can I still make a lot of general applications to my situation? Absolutely. I think Larson summarized that in a great way. So if you find yourself as a Christian, you feel like you're the object of persecution. You feel like you're surrounded by false religion. You're totally discouraged by that. What's the other thing you said, Larson?
Worldliness.
Yeah, people are they don't care about right and wrong. The people who aren't practicing false religion are just living for themselves, and you're discouraged by that. And certainly that's going to make you, someone who's trying to live for God, a target. And you say, what are we going to do? Well, the same message that was told to these Christians in the first century is for us. Stay faithful, wait on the Lord, do not give up your faith for anything, and wait on the Lord's victory.
Yeah, and one thing that makes the book of Revelation difficult is the symbolic language. But we need to accept that it is symbolic language. So I'm just thinking about verse 20. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So right off, what did John see? Well, if I understand correctly, John saw 7 stars and 7 golden lampstands. But what Jesus is telling him is there's a symbolic value to those things. And everybody who reads the book of Revelation, even people who claim to be experts on the book, realize that there is some symbolic language in the book. And some people will say, no, I take the book of Revelation literally. I take it word for word literally. Well, then they'll come to the locusts and they'll say, well, those are Apache helicopters, but that's reading it literally. Well, that's not literally. That's symbolic too. So everybody agrees that there are some symbols here. What we want to do is interpret those symbols accurately. And I think the best place in order to be able to determine what these symbols mean is the rest of the Bible. So one of the things that Tad said when we were discussing what we were going to talk about this week, well, what about reading Revelation responsibly? And he said, well, the first thing I would recommend is start somewhere else. And I think that's exactly right. But of the 404 verses in Revelation, 278 of them have a specific allusion to the Old Testament. And some of those have multiple, 2 or 3. So some have counted there's more than 500 references over 400 verses to the Old Testament. It would be impossible to appreciate the book of Revelation without having a working knowledge of the Old Testament. And most of the books that are cited are books we're not terribly familiar with, like Daniel, the second half of Daniel, not the first half that everybody knows, Ezekiel, Zechariah. And so there's this storehouse of symbols that's being drawn upon that if we're starting in Revelation, we're already starting behind the 8 ball. And so what we need to do is we need to have a general sense of the Old Testament, of especially those prophetic books, before we come to the book of Revelation. And so I think that will help us to say, here are some symbols, and we don't just have to make up what those symbols are. We can go and say, okay, 4 horsemen. Well, Zechariah talks about 4 horsemen in chapter 1. What did they mean there? And then we come to the book of Revelation, and we already have a category to be able to understand those things.
Very good. Something else, and we mentioned this already, but, as you're going through chapter 1, you get to verse 4, John to the 7 churches which are in Asia. Yeah. Well, there was some context surrounding what was going on in the first century with those churches in that location. And that's very significant to the message that's being revealed here as well. And we would expect that. I like what you said earlier, Larson, when you were talking about the book of Romans, the epistle to Romans or Corinthians or whatever it is. We read that recognizing Paul's writing to someone dealing with certain things, and we first interpret that message as it applies to them, and then we look at it and say, well, how would that apply to us as well? And that's what we need to do with the book of Revelation. And I think out of all the books in the New Testament, I think probably the book of Revelation, people are more apt to say, well, this is written directly to us. And I think that's because it's been presented that way to them in some way. But naturally, we wouldn't do that. And we need to be careful that as we look at this, we would look at it the same way we would look at any other book in the Bible, in saying this has an audience that it applied to with a certain situation in mind. And we look at that and we see how that applies primarily first to them.
Yeah, I know I'm talking a lot, but I think about the difficulty of the book of Revelation. And I think we would all admit there are some passages in Revelation that are just hard. They're difficult to understand exactly what's being talked about. Maybe we can get the main point or the general idea, but the specifics are difficult. But that's true with other places in the Scripture too. So you were talking about the book of Romans, and we mentioned Romans chapter 9. There are some hard things about Romans chapter 9. But what do we do with that? Well, we go back and we look at the Old Testament references that are made, and we try to understand them in their context. And then we try to use passages that are clearer, that we know, that are very clear to understand, and we use those to interpret this difficult passage, Romans chapter 9. Well, that's what we would do with Revelation chapter 9, right? We would say there are some Old Testament references there. Let's tie those together. Let's put those in there. And then also, let's use clearer passages in order to be able to understand other passages. For example, the New Testament is very clear that God has already established His kingdom with Christ as the head. That's true in Revelation chapter 1. John says twice that God has made us to be a kingdom. That's in chapter 1 and verse 6, and made us a kingdom, priest to his God. Chapter 9, chapter 1, verse 9, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Christ Jesus. Now, a lot of people come to the book of Revelation and say, this is talking about the end of the world when Jesus is finally going to establish His kingdom. Well, I can use some pretty clear passages in chapter 1 to say, no, God's kingdom's already been established, and John was a citizen of it, and the people he was writing to were citizens of it. So we've got to reframe our thinking based on these clear passages so that when we come to Revelation 20, we're not just making something up out of the blue. We're using clear passages to understand those more difficult ones.
And just kind of going back to the idea of symbolism, we appreciate verse 20. We don't have to guess what the lampstands are, don't have to guess what the stars are. You appreciate a verse like that. But we don't always get passages like that. And so what do we do if we're not sure what a symbol refers to specifically? What would be a good idea? Would you think it would be a good idea to reserve judgment about what that might be and say, well, I'll wait on this. I'm going to wait. I'm going to hold on, reserve making any judgment on this. And then here's a question, and I'll let you guys discuss this more. Do we have to know what every symbol in Revelation means specifically to know what God wants us to do to survive persecution and whatever circumstances we find ourselves in?
I hope not.
That's right.
Good answer.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. And we understand that when we come to other Bible texts and say, look, I'm struggling here, but I know the point of Romans 8, even if I don't know all the details or something like that. And the book of Revelation is, there's disagreement about when it was written, which would affect what the specific symbols are referring to. And there are maybe specific questions about how some of these things are being fulfilled. And yet the lesson, Revelation 17 has been helpful to me as a summary of the book. In verse 14, they will make war on the Lamb. He's talked about all the enemies of God's people, represented by these beasts and by the dragon and by the harlot of Babylon. You've got all these enemies of God's people. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And I think that's about as good of a summary of the book as we have, that all of these forces are going to oppose the Lord, but he's going to be victorious. So what's the instruction? Well, places like chapter 14 and verse 12. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God in their faith in Jesus Christ. You know, the response to all of these challenges are not to avoid, using debit cards because they might have the mark of the beast or something like that. The response is be faithful to God. Endure, keep his commandments. Endure to the end because Jesus Christ is going to be victorious.
Yeah, I was just thinking earlier as Lonnie was reading a little bit of that Facebook post that I think you mentioned earlier, and it was a fairly lengthy post, but it was just trying to assign a lot of the things that are currently going on to the book of Revelation. And the thing that stood out to me is that the things that are currently going on don't even resemble the exact things that are going on in the book of Revelation. Like Revelation seems to be very specific about those Christians who are suffering for the sake of their Christianity. It wasn't some just some random thing. They were very specific that they were suffering for their faith, and the messages that for them is what we just mentioned, is to endure, be faithful until death, or be faithful even if it costs you your life, and you'll receive the crown of righteousness. So again, if we're going to try to bring Revelation into the discussion today, we need to make certain that it makes sense to do that. Like what we see would need to actually resemble what was going on in Revelation.
Yeah, I think, of course, there's an appropriate application of the book. But we need to be responsible in how we read the book so that we understand it in its context, and then we can apply it more faithfully.
Yeah. So I'm guessing if you're listening and thought in the very beginning that we were going to tell you everything you need to know about Revelation, we did not do that. As a matter of fact, we may have just muddied water. But anyway, we thought this was a timely conversation, and I think it is good that when we see the events going on around us, we do at least think about there is something to come. And if this is causing people to think about the afterlife or the second coming or anything like that, then that would be good. But perhaps you have questions maybe about the book of Revelation. Maybe you have questions about things that are going on in our world today and how we should be responding. There are a lot of hard things that are going on right now, and certainly I don't think we have specific answers for all of them, but I think we do have good answers for all of it ultimately, and they all come from God. So thank you for listening. If we can help you come to a better understanding of some Bible passage or Bible topic, you have a question that you'd like to hear us discuss, we'd be glad to do that. Reach out to us, proveallthings@mail.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.